Good evening, my friends. Tonight, before you close your eyes, let's walk back in time, not to the grand victories of kings or the splendor of their feasts, but to the quiet, suffocating heartbeat that pulsed beneath silk gowns and golden crowns. Imagine a candle flickering against the cold stone of a Tudor palace, its flame bending in the draught of 1,000 whispered prayers. It is the year 1536, and somewhere inside this palace, a woman wakes before dawn, knowing that the sun will rise whether she smiles or not, whether she eats or starves, whether she lives or dies. She is a queen, or at least she is supposed to be, and her name might be Catherine, or Anne, or Jane, but in truth, her name does not matter, because to be the wife of Henry VIII is to carry a crown that devours the one who wears it. The bed she lies in is heavy with brocade and shadow. A maid sleeps on the floor beside her, not out of loyalty, but to watch, to record every turn, every sigh, every restless murmur in the dark, because even her dreams are political. She cannot weep without it being noticed, cannot pray without it being reported. The curtains open with the faint creak of wood and silk. Light leaks in, grey and unforgiving. She sits up, dizzy, her ribs aching from yesterday's corset, her hair tangled with pins that have drawn blood from her scalp. She will be dressed by 8 women, each one a pair of eyes that belong not to her, but to the men who placed them there, ambassadors, ministers, and spies who feed the king's curiosity about the body he calls his own. It will take 2 hours to make her into something the world will accept. Layers of linen, whalebone, and velvet that hide her human softness beneath the architecture of authority. Her breath will shorten. Her waist will vanish. Her skin will grow pale beneath the powder that is slowly poisoning her. She will smile through the pain, because every expression is a performance. She is not a woman anymore. She is an icon built on bones and blood and borrowed time. Outside, the chapel bell tolls, calling her to morning prayers. And as she kneels upon the cold stone floor, she will think of the queens who knelt there before her, Catherine of Aragon, whose tears stained these same stones when she was cast aside after 20 years of devotion, and Anne Boleyn, whose laughter once filled these corridors until it echoed all the way to the scaffold. At the table, her breakfast waits white bread and ale, untouched. Hunger is unladylike, appetite is sin, and desire of any kind can be used against her. She will pretend to eat, smiling gently while courtiers bow, waiting for her nods, her blessings, her signatures. Every word she speaks will ripple through the kingdom like a drop of blood in clear water. And if her hand trembles as she signs, if her smile falters for even a heartbeat, someone will notice. They always notice. They will write it down and whisper it to someone who will whisper it to the king, who will see in her exhaustion not humanity, but rebellion. A queen must never tire. A queen must never bleed. A queen must never fail to be divine. By noon she will sit in a hall that smells of roasted meat and perfume, while hundreds of eyes follow her every movement. The table before her glitters with silver, yet she tastes nothing. Aroastet swan, its feathers reattached to look alive. A pea shaped like a castle. Dishes painted with gold leaf, all symbols of a kingdom's wealth that she cannot even touch. The hall resounds with music, the gentle trill of lutes, but her body aches from hunger and the weight of the gown pressing on her ribs. Still, she smiles, because queenship is theatre, and theatre must go on until the curtain falls in blood. Even the dancers move carefully around her, as if she might shatter. She already has, but no one can see it. Afternoon brings the physician, and with him the leeches He bows, murmuring words of care that sound like a prayer, and she sits still as he places them on her temples. They feed until her skin pales and her head swims. When he removes them, she thanks him for his mercy. It is the same mercy that has killed countless others, but gratitude is expected, and gratitude keeps her alive. The blood that runs down her face will be wiped away, and her ladies will reapply the lead-based powder that hides her bruises and blisters. The same poison that makes her beautiful is slowly stealing her mind. Her hair, her fertility, but beauty is survival, and survival is all that matters. When the day fades into shadow, she will dance if the king commands it, even if her feet are bleeding, even if her back burns from the poultices that have seared her skin. She will smile through the pain because pain itself is a kind of proof that she is obedient, proof that she deserves the fragile peace of another dawn. When the music stops, she will bow her head, kiss the king's hand, and return to her chambers, where the ritual begins again in reverse. The jewels are counted, the corset unlaced, the breath released. For a moment, she feels almost alive, but the silence that follows is worse than the noise. The lady at the foot of her bed watches her again, Ben in Hunt, recording her sighs, and the queen wonders, is there any part of her that is still her own? In the deep of night, when the palace sleeps and the wind rattles the stained glass like bones, she lies awake and counts her heartbeats. Each one could be her last. Somewhere in the darkness, she can hear the ghosts of those who came before her. Catherine praying for a son who never came. Anne whispering her final confession. Jane gasping for breath as fever takes her. Catherine Howard crying out for forgiveness. Catherine Parr writing one last letter she will never finish. 6 wives. 6 stories. One fate that repeats like a curse carved into the very stones of England. Each believed she could survive where the others had fallen. Each thought love or faith or obedience might save her. None of them were right. And so, my friends, when you see their portraits, the perfect faces, the jeweled hoods, the serene eyes staring from gilded frames, remember what the paint cannot show. Beneath that perfection lies hunger, fear, bruise, and silence. Beneath the crown lies a woman trying not to drown in her own life. Being a Tudor queen was not a dream. It was a daily crucifixion dressed in silk and called majesty. Every hour of every day was a step closer to either death or disgrace. That is what it meant to wear the crown of Henry VIII. Not to rule, not to love, not even to live, but to endure. Now close your eyes and imagine that same candle still burning in the palace corridor, its flame trembling as footsteps approach. Another queen will rise tomorrow. Another will kneel. Another will bleed. The crown waits, gleaming in the half-light, ready to claim another soul. Sleep, if you can, knowing that once upon a time, a woman wore it, and it consumed her whole. When the first light touched the curtains of the Queen's chamber, it was not the same woman who had closed her eyes the night before. For the story we step into now belongs to Catherine of Aragon, the first wife. The long-suffering wife, the woman who waited more than half her life for a son who never came. She was not born for tragedy, she was born for majesty. In the royal courts of Spain, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, conquerors and visionaries who stitched together a kingdom with blood and iron. She was trained from childhood to be a queen, taught to kneel in prayer before she could read, taught to speak with the calm certainty of divine right, and promised to England long before she had ever seen its reign. When she arrived, still a girl, the air of that foreign country must have felt heavier, colder, as if the sun itself refused to follow her across the sea. But she smiled through the fog because she believed in destiny, in the union of 2 nations. in love that could be sanctified by faith. She first married Arthur, the Prince of Wales, Henry's elder brother, a frail boy whose health trembled like the flame of a candle in a draught. Their marriage lasted only a few months. He died in the chill of Ludlow Castle, and she was left a widow before her 17th year. She might have returned to Spain, might have become a relic of diplomacy, forgotten in some convent, but she stayed not by choice, but because her dowry, her honor, and her future were all pieces in a larger game. Years passed, and she waited, a foreign woman, stranded in a foreign court, her Spanish ladies dismissed one by one, her letters to her parents growing more desperate, her faith, the only thing that did not abandon her. Then came Henry Young, radiant, newly crowned, promising her not just marriage but the renewal of purpose. She believed him. She had to. The wedding took place in the summer of 1509. The bells of London rang, the streets were carpeted with flowers, and the people cheered for the young couple who seemed born to rule together. Catherine wore a gown of white satin embroidered with gold, her hair loose beneath a jewelled veil, her face shining with hope. For a time, it truly seemed that God had rewarded her patience. Henry was attentive, passionate, eager to prove himself worthy of his Spanish bride. Together they prayed, hunted, danced, and shared dreams of a dynasty that would rival any in Europe. When their first child was conceived, the entire kingdom held its breath. But the baby, a daughter, lived only a few hours. Catherine did not cry in public. She thanked God for the trial and whispered that she would bear another soon. She did, again and again. 6 pregnancies, 6 prayers sent to heaven, and only one child survived, a girl, Mary, born in 1516. Small but strong, and to her mother's eyes, perfect. Henry smiled at first, proud enough to believe that sons would follow, but as the years passed and the cradle remained empty, that smile turned into distance, then into silence, then into the kind of anger that can no longer find a place to hide. Catherine grew thinner, her hair streaked with silver, her back curved slightly from the weight of her corsets, and her grief. Still, she carried herself with dignity. She ruled the household, oversaw the education of her daughter, managed the court's affairs with grace that even her enemies admired. She was queen in every way that mattered. Except one, she could not give the king a son. The Tudor court was a labyrinth of ambition, where faith and fear walked hand in hand. For years, Catherine endured rumours, pressure, and prayers that turned to accusations. Henry, restless and aging, began to look elsewhere for comfort, and his eyes fell upon a woman with dark hair and a voice that could cut through any silence. Anne Boleyn. Catherine saw the danger before anyone else did. She could feel it in the air, a change in the tone of her ladies, the new songs in the great hall, the way courtiers bowed slightly deeper when Anne passed. She had spent her life studying the subtle languages of survival, and this one was clear. The king was slipping away. But Catherine was no fool. She had survived the death of one husband and would not surrender this one without a fight. When Henry demanded that their marriage be annulled, claiming that it had been cursed from the beginning because she had once been his brother's wife, Catherine's blood ran cold. She had lived as queen for more than 20 years, and now she was being asked to say it had all been sin. She refused. Before every council, before every envoy, before the Pope himself, she stood unshaken. "I am your true wife," she said, "and while I live, I will call myself nothing else." Even those who served Henry secretly admired her defiance. She argued not with fury but with sorrow. and the truth in her voice made men tremble. Yet truth is powerless against desire, and Henry's desire was a storm that broke the church itself. The years that followed became a slow erasure. Catherine was sent away from court, stripped of her jewels, her title, her friends. She was called the Dowager Princess of Wales, as if the last 2 decades of her life had been a mistake written in the wrong ink. The walls of her new residence at Kimbleton Castle were damp and narrow, and the air smelled of illness. Her letters to her daughter were censored, her confessor replaced by those loyal to the king. She prayed in the mornings for mercy and in the evenings for deliverance. But heaven stayed silent. Her body weakened, her hair thinned, her skin turned the pale colour of old parchment. When messengers came from London, she no longer asked what they carried. She already knew, and yet, even in exile, she remained regal. The servants who attended her swore that she still sat upright at meals, still insisted on hearing Mass every morning, still addressed every visitor with the dignity of a queen. She refused to curse Henry, though he had abandoned her. Instead, she prayed for his soul and for the child who bore her name and her eyes. Sometimes she would hold Mary's letters against her chest and whisper, "Courage, hija mía. One day, the truth will speak again." Those were the last words her ladies ever heard her say clearly. On a January morning in 1536, the same year that would take Anne Boleyn to the scaffold, Catherine of Aragon died quietly in her bed. They said her heart, when examined after death, was blackened, as though burned by fire. The court physicians claimed it was a sign of poison, but those who loved her said it was grief. Grief that had gathered for so many years it had turned to ash inside her. When news reached Henry, he dressed in yellow from head to toe, claiming it was the colour of joy and rebirth. He said it was for their daughter's sake, that England must look forward, but even his courtiers knew better. The yellow was not joy. It was guilt trying to disguise itself. Catherine was buried in Peterborough Abbey, not as a queen but as a princess. Her coffin covered with simple black cloth. No trumpets, nor crown, no procession of peers. Only the soft chant of monks and the faint echo of footsteps on cold stone. But among the crowd, hidden behind a veil, there were women who wept as if the kingdom itself had died. They knew what the chronicles would not record, that Catherine of Aragon had been the last true queen in spirit. A woman who ruled not with beauty or intrigue, but with endurance. And perhaps, if you listen closely, you can still hear her voice in the corridors of every palace Henry built. The voice that told him once, "In this world, there is a power greater than a king's desire." He did not believe her then. He would learn later, through blood and ruin, that she had been right. For every queen who came after Catherine would inherit her curse. To be loved by Henry VIII was to be loved by a man who mistook longing for destiny, who built altars to his own reflection, and who demanded perfection from women already broken by the weight of his crown. Catherine's daughter would one day become Queen Mary, the only surviving child of all Henry's marriages, and though history would remember her as Bloody Mary, the truth is simpler and more tragic. She carried her mother's faith, her mother's sorrow, her mother's need to be seen as rightful. When she lit the pyres that consumed her enemies, she believed she was restoring justice, the same justice her mother had been denied. It was Catherine's ghost guiding her hand, the same ghost that would forever haunt the English throne, whispering that holiness could never survive the touch of power. So the first queen's story ends not with fire, nor with the echo of the axe, but with a slow fading into silence. Yet in that silence lives the echo of every prayer she ever uttered. Every moment she endured humiliation and refused to bow. She was the queen who would not vanish, the woman who kept her faith when faith was a weapon, And though the world moved on, her spirit remained quiet, steadfast, eternal. The candle that once burned for Catherine of Aragon still flickers in the dark corners of English history. Fin but inextinguished. A reminder that dignity can outlive even kings. And somewhere, beneath the stones of Peterborough, a heart still beats in memory, not of triumph, but of endurance, the purest form of victory any queen ever achieved. The story does not rest with Catherine's final prayer. History, restless and cruel, moved on almost before the earth had closed above her coffin. In the spring of that same year, 1536, the corridors of the English court trembled again beneath the silk hem of a different queen. Her name was Anne Boleyn, and she did not walk like a woman born to bow. She walked as if the air itself bent around her. Where Catherine had been solemn, Anne was light. Where the first queen prayed, the second laughed. She had eyes dark as ink, a voice that sparkled with wit, sharper than any sword, and a mind that could see 3 moves ahead of every man in the room. But behind that charm, behind the confidence and the clever glances, there was something no one could quite define. The strange awareness that she was not only rising toward glory, but walking toward fire. Anne had spent her youth at the French court, learning how words could be weapons, how glances could build or destroy, how to make silence more dangerous than a scream. When she returned to England, the court did not know what to do with her. She was not the kind of woman they were used to. She spoke freely. She questioned priests. She argued with scholars. And she made even the most powerful men feel small. Henry saw her and saw not a mistress, not even a wife, but a revelation, the living promise of a new beginning. He had grown weary of obedience, weary of the slow, loyal patience of Catherine. Anne was the opposite. She was thunder disguised as music. She refused to be his concubine, refused to be touched until he made her queen. And Henry, blinded by desire and pride, tore apart his kingdom to give her that crown. It took 7 years of rebellion, of lawsuits, of papal defiance, and blood on parchment to unmake one marriage and create another. Henry destroyed his alliance with Spain, excommunicated himself from Rome, declared himself the head of a new church, all for a woman who promised him not only passion but sons. When Anne finally walked into Westminster Abbey to be crowned, England seemed to hold its breath. Bells rang, trumpets roared, and the streets were flooded with banners embroidered in gold thread. Yet behind the celebration there were whispers. The people murmured that the king's first wife still lived, that this was no true marriage, that the crown itself had been stolen. Anne heard them. She smiled wider. But even as she lifted her head beneath the weight of that crown, she felt it pressing into her like iron teeth. She was brilliant at first. The court glowed under her light. She dressed in French silks and jeweled sleeves that shimmered like the wings of a raven. She surrounded herself with poets and musicians, discussed theology with reformers, and argued scripture with bishops who dared not contradict her. She was not a queen who stayed silent in corners. She wanted to shape England itself. She persuaded Henry to appoint Thomas Cranmer and Thomas Cromwell, both men of the new faith, believing that together they could make England modern, pure, divine. But power has a cruel rhythm. It invites admiration for a moment and envy forever. The same courtiers who once bowed before Anne began to wait for her to fall. They watched her temper flare, her words grow sharp, her pride swell into something that even Henry could no longer control. She had given birth to a daughter, the child who would one day become Elizabeth, and though the baby was strong and beautiful, Henry's disappointment was like frost on new blossoms. "A daughter," he said, "is no true heir. Anne promised him sons, but her womb betrayed her again and again. Miscarriages, silences, months of fear and whispered prayers. With every failure, the distance between them widened until the air itself grew cold. Still, she fought. Anne was not made to surrender. She charmed, pleaded, argued, seduced, preached, and when none of it worked, she turned to anger. The king's affection began to rot beneath the weight of his disappointment. Another woman appeared pale, gentle Jane Seymour and Henry's gaze. Once Aulame for Anne, cooled to something dangerous. The queen felt the shift before anyone else did. She saw it in the way his courtiers stopped meeting her eyes, in the way the musicians hesitated before playing her favourite songs, in the way her own ladies spoke to her more softly, as if comforting someone already condemned. The palace walls seemed to lean closer. Listening, every word she said became a rumour. Every glance, a possible sin. And in that atmosphere of fear, Thomas Cromwell, the king's trusted minister, found his opportunity. Cromwell had once served Anne, but she had humiliated him before others, dismissed his ideas, mocked his faith. He never forgot. Quietly, he began to weave a web of accusations so fine that even innocence could not escape it. He spoke to servants, to musicians, to men who had once smiled too long in the Queen's direction. He built a case out of glances and shadows, out of nothing. By the spring of 1536, the trap was ready. Anne miscarried again, a boy this time. Stillborn, and Henry's heart turned completely to stone. "I see that God will not give me sons by her," he said. "She shall not prevent me from having them by another." Within weeks, the Queen was accused of adultery, incest, witchcraft, the most impossible sins, yet the most fatal. Even those who loved her fell silent. The same men who had toasted her rise now wrote her death warrants. They came for her at Greenwich Palace on the 2nd day of May. She was taken to the Tower of London by barge along the Thames, the same river that had once reflected her coronation banners. The water was grey and cold that morning, and she stood on the deck, calm, her hands folded, watching the spires of the city slide past. "No traitor's wife shall enter this tower," she said, "for I'm the king's true wife." The guards did not answer. When the gates closed behind her, she knew the world she had built was gone. In her chambers in the tower, she wrote letters, one to Henry, pleading not for her life but for the safety of their daughter, another to the council, denying every charge. Her handwriting trembled only once, on the word mercy. The trial was a performance, cruel and exacting. The peers of the realm, all men, all afraid of the king's disfavour, listened to invented stories as though they were gospel. The Queen stood before them, dressed in black velvet, her face pale but composed. When they read the accusations, she laughed, not the laughter of madness, but the sound of someone who sees the absurdity of her own doom. She defended herself with intelligence sharper than any lawyer. But truth was no longer relevant. The verdict had been written long before the trial began. Guilty, they said. The sentence, death by burning or by the sword, at the king's mercy. Henry, generous in cruelty, chose the sword. The morning of the execution was bright and windless. The scaffold had been built within the tower grounds, near the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. Anne rose early, prayed, and dressed herself in a gown of grey damask, trimmed with fur, her hair bound under a small white coif. When the lieutenant of the tower came for her, she thanked him with a smile that startled him. It was not the smile of a prisoner, but of someone stepping into eternity. The crowd was small, carefully chosen, courtiers and guards. silent as she climbed the steps. She looked not afraid, only fragile, like glass that knows it is about to break. "I have always been a faithful servant to the king," she said softly. "I pray God save him and give him a long reign, for he has been good and gracious to me." She knelt upon the straw, whispered one last prayer, and waited. The French swordsman, brought from Calais for his skill, struck once, swift and clean. He hit Phil, and with it, the last illusion that power could ever protect a woman in that world. When the body was carried to the chapel, wrapped in linen, the sound of the sword still hung in the air like a memory refusing to fade. Henry married Jane Seymour 11 days later. The court wore bright colours. Music returned. The servants scrubbed away the blood and prepared the chambers for the new queen. But no amount of perfume could erase the scent of loss that lingered in those rooms. Anne's daughter, Elizabeth, was declared illegitimate. Her mother's name struck from prayers. Her portrait removed. Yet the ghost of Anne Boleyn did not fade with the years. She lingered in the corridors, in the mirrors, in the very air of the palace. And perhaps that is her true triumph. Not the crown, not the love that turned to execution, but the persistence of her presence. They could cut off her head, but they could not silence her mind. Through her daughter, she would rise again, not as a condemned woman, but as the mother of a queen greater than any king England had ever known. The same wit, the same fire, the same hunger for knowledge would live on in Elizabeth, who would rule not through a husband's desire but through her own unbroken will. In that sense, Anne Boleyn won the only victory that mattered. She lost her life, but she gave birth to the future. So, when you think of her, the woman with the dark eyes and the dangerous smile, do not see only the axe and the scaffold. See the woman who dared to teach a king what love could do, who changed the faith of a nation, who walked willingly into history knowing it would end in death. She was the queen who laughed too loud, loved too fiercely, and paid the price with her blood. Yet even now, Century la Terre, if you stand by the tower walls at dusk, when the light turns gold and the ravens circle, you might hear a faint whisper carried by the wind, not a cry, but a laugh, defiant, echoing still through the stones that once tried to silence her. The sword that ended Anne's life had barely cooled when another woman was led quietly through the same palace corridors. Her footsteps, small, her voice careful, her face lowered in humility. Jane Seymour entered the story as if she wished not to disturb the dust left behind by those who had screamed before her. She was pale where Anne had been vivid, soft where Anne had been sharp, obedient where Anne had been defiant. But beneath the lace and lowered lashes, there was a stillness that could not be mistaken for weakness. She had watched everything: Catherine's endurance, Anne's rise and fall, and she understood the pattern that ruled Henry's heart. She knew that gentleness could be a weapon, that silence could be strategy, that to survive a king who had murdered his love, one must make love appear holy again. Jane was born into a lesser branch of the nobility, without the sophistication of the French courts or the political sharpness of the Boleyns, but her simplicity became her shield. She had served both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn as lady-in-waiting, and she had seen what ambition did to queens. When the king's eyes began to rest on her, this quiet, modest woman, with hands folded and words few, she played the role with instinctive precision. She did not flirt. She blushed. She did not argue. She listened. When Henry sent her a purse of gold, she returned it, untouched, with the message that she would take nothing from him unless it came with honor. The refusal was not coyness. It was a performance of virtue so flawless that it reached the core of his vanity. Here was the woman who could redeem him, who could erase the sin of Anne's death and restore the image of a king chosen by God rather than cursed by desire. Their courtship was a whisper, not a thunderclap, where Anne's story had been shouted in the streets. Jane's unfolded in silence. Within weeks of Anne's execution, the banns were read, and by the end of May, the new queen stood beside the same man who had made widows of the world. Her wedding gown was white and silver, her expression tranquil, her fate already sealed by the vows she spoke. To the people of England, weary of scandal, she seemed a blessing, the gentle, pious queen who would heal the wounds of the nation. And for a time, she did. Henry softened beside her. He smiled again. He called her my beloved wife. And for once, the word did not sound like a lie. But marriage to Henry was never peace. It was merely the calm before another storm. Jane learned to move through her days as if walking through a chapel, slow, deliberate, quiet. She attended Mass every morning, embroidered altar cloths with her own hands, and spoke only when spoken to. The courtiers soon learned that the Queen had no hunger for politics. Yet she carried influence in subtler ways. When she knelt before the king to beg him to reconcile with his daughter Mary, the child he had declared a bastard, she wept until he relented. That moment alone made the people love her more than all the pageants in London. They saw in her the reflection of Catherine's grace without Catherine's defiance. And Henry, proud of his gentle dove, began to dream again of sons. By the winter of 1536, the Queen was with child, and the court trembled between hope and fear. The last two queens had failed to give the king the one thing he wanted most. The priests thanked heaven. The midwives prepared their herbs and linens. Henry rode to the shrines and promised God altars of gold, if only this child would be a boy. Jane prayed too, though her prayers were quieter, private whispers that no chronicler could ever record. She was not praying for glory. She was praying to survive. Her pregnancy passed with the stillness of winter snow. The court grew careful around her. No one spoke loudly. No one dared bring bad news into her presence. Henry, who had once left his wives to dine alone, now spent his evenings at her side, his hand resting on her rounded stomach, his face filled with the fragile wonder of a man who thinks he might have been forgiven. Jane smiled when he smiled, nodded when he spoke of the future, and endured when he pressed too much hope upon her shoulders. She knew that love in this court was a performance, but she performed it flawlessly, and that performance became truth in its own quiet way. Then came the autumn of 1537, and with it, the hour of reckoning. The labour began in October, and it did not end. For 3 days and 3 nights, the Queen cried out in a chamber sealed with prayers and the thick scent of burning candles. Midwives hurried in and out. Priests whispered psalms at the doorway, and Henry paced like a man who had forgotten how to breathe. Outside the palace, the people knelt in the mud and begged God to save their queen. On the morning of the 4th day, a cry finally echoed through the corridors, not Jane's, but a child's. The prince had come, and he was alive. Edward. The name swept through the kingdom like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Bells rang across London. Cannons fired from the tower, and the people drank to the health of the newborn heir. The king wept openly for joy. This day, Ed declared, God has remembered England. He called Jane his phoenix, risen from the ashes of his past sins. The court rejoiced, and for a brief and perfect moment, the world seemed repaired. But even as the king celebrated, the queen lay pale and trembling in her bed, her strength ebbing away like the tide. The bleeding began that night. At first, the physicians said it was nothing, that childbirth often left women weak, that she would recover. But by the 2nd day, The smell of fever filled the room, and Jane's pulse fluttered like the wings of a trapped bird. Henry sat beside her, holding her hand, a hand already growing cold, and for the first time in his life, he looked helpless. The priests returned to the chamber. The candles burned lower. Outside, the infant prince slept in his cradle, the future of England, wrapped in swaddling cloth. While his mother's breaths grew shorter, she whispered prayers in Latin, her voice barely more than air. "Jesu, mercy," she said, again and again, until even the mercy left her. On the 12th day after the birth, the Queen of England was dead. She was 28 years old. Her body was wrapped in white silk and placed in a coffin lined with lead. The king ordered mourning across the realm. But his grief was a strange and heavy thing, not the rage of loss, but the shock of a man who had finally loved something fragile and watched it die. He dressed in black and shut himself away for days. When he emerged, he was thinner, his hair streaked with grey, his eyes sunk deep with sleeplessness. He had gained a son, but lost the only woman who had ever made him feel redeemed. The funeral was held at St. George's Chapel in Windsor. The procession moved through the cold November mist, torches flickering against the stone walls. Monks chanted softly as the coffin was lowered into the crypt. Henry did not attend. He said he could not bear it, though some whispered that he simply could not face the sight of death that carried his own name within it. He would later be buried beside her, the only wife he chose to share his tomb. Perhaps, even in his pride, he understood that this woman, quiet and unassuming, had been the one who gave him everything he ever asked for and paid for it with her life. The court wore mourning for 40 days. During that time, the king ordered that no one speak ill of Jane, that her memory be honoured with reverence. He called her the fairest and truest of all my wives. The words were not flattery, they were confession. Yet time, that slow assassin of memory, continued its work. Before the year had passed, whispers began again in the corridors. Talk of new alliances, new queens, new hope. Henry's grief softened into hunger. The wheel turned, as it always did. But somewhere in the stillness of Windsor, a tomb lay beneath the stone, and within it rested the woman who had carried, the only true heir he would ever have, the woman who had turned pain into salvation. Jane Seymour's legacy was not in her beauty, though her portraits show a calm loveliness framed by pale linen, nor in her words, for she spoke little. Her legacy was in endurance, in the quiet power that outlasted the noise of ambition. She was the pause between storms, the breath the kingdom took between executions and divorces, the small candle that burned briefly yet illuminated everything around it. If Catherine of Aragon had been faith, and Anne Boleyn had been fire, then Jane was peace, fragile, fleeting, and doomed to disappear the moment men reached for it. Even now, when the wind moves through the cloisters of Windsor, it seems to carry her name, not as a cry, but as a sigh soft, forgiving, eternal. She left behind a son who would rule too young and die too soon, a husband who would never again find joy, and a legend that no scandal could tarnish. For though her life ended in pain, her memory endured without stain. She was the queen who died for perfection, the woman who gave a kingdom its heir, and a sinner his last chance at grace. And perhaps, in the silence of that final night, when the fever broke her body and the light dimmed, she understood what none of the others ever could, that to love a man like Henry VIII was to be crowned by death itself, and that sometimes mercy comes only when the heart stops beating. After the funeral bells of Windsor fell silent and the black banners were lowered, England exhaled a long, weary breath. The court smelled of wax and mourning cloth. And for a while, even Henry seemed hollow, as if Jane's death had carved a space in him that nothing could fill. But the crown has a rhythm of its own. It cannot stop for grief. The kingdom needed stability, alliances, heirs for the future beyond the fragile child, asleep in his cradle. So the king, heavy and aging, turned again toward the business of marriage, not for love this time, nor redemption, but necessity. It was politics that guided his gaze north and east, toward a woman he had never met, a princess whose portrait promised peace. Her name was Anne of Cleves, and she would become the only one of Henry's wives to smile when she looked back at the cage she had escaped. Anne came not from a grand empire like Spain, nor from the glittering circles of France, but from the quiet Duchy of Cleves, a Protestant corner of the Rhineland where women were taught modesty, piety, and the art of obedience. She grew up among grey castles and cold rivers, her world shaped by the hum of prayer and the simplicity of northern air. When the proposal came from England, it was more political than personal, an alliance between two Protestant states to protect against the Catholic powers that pressed from all sides. She did not protest. She had been raised to serve her family's duty. And the thought of being a queen, though distant, must have shimmered faintly like frost under morning light. She had never seen Henry's face, never heard his voice, and perhaps that was her first blessing. While Holbein painted her portrait, he softened her features with the gentleness of an artist, hoping to please a client who had already beheaded too many wives. The result was a face serene and dignified, eyes lowered in modesty, lips barely curved into a promise of calm. When the painting reached Henry, he was enchanted. "She is like a fair and gentle lady," he said, and in those words lay the ruin of his expectations. For what he imagined was beauty, he also imagined obedience, and what he desired was not a woman, but a mirror, one that would reflect only his comfort, his triumph, his peace. Anne set sail for England in the winter of 1539. The sea was cruel, grey, and cold, but she endured it without complaint. When she stepped onto English soil at Dover, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The king, impatient as always, could not wait for ceremony. Disguised, he rode to Rochester, where she was resting, hoping to surprise her in the way lovers of legend do, testing whether passion might bloom before politics sealed it. He burst into her chambers in plain clothes, expecting delight. But the woman who turned to greet him saw only a stranger, broad and flushed, and far older than the image she had been promised. She curtsied politely, confused, unaware that the man before her was her future husband. Henry's pride shattered in an instant. "She is nothing so fair as her picture," he muttered later. And from that moment, Anne's fate, though blessed in its own strange way, was sealed. The wedding could not be undone without offending her brother, without breaking the alliance England desperately needed. So on the 6th of January, 1540, Henry married Anne of Cleves in Greenwich Palace. The ceremony was splendid, the music triumphant, but the king's smile never reached his eyes. The courtiers noticed. The whispers began, and on the wedding night, when expectation turned to humiliation, Henry emerged, claiming that he could not consummate the marriage. "I like her not," he said, "for she has in her person neither beauty nor virgin freshness." Whether it was truth or the impotence of a man decaying in spirit, none could say. But in a court where desire had the force of law, Anne's innocence became her salvation. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Henry avoided her, muttering about annulment. Yet Anne, who had learned long ago that silence could be a shield, bore the distance with grace. She was not educated in the ways of politics or courtly charm, but she possessed a kind of wisdom that comes from quiet observation. She did not demand, did not weep, did not flatter. She waited. When Cromwell, the architect of this unhappy union, tried to defend the match, Henry turned his fury upon him instead. Within months, Cromwell's head fell to the block, and Anne was summoned to hear her own fate. She must have thought then that her life would end, as the others had, with accusation, trial, and execution. But Henry, perhaps weary of blood, offered mercy in a language only he could understand. He asked for annulment, not death. Anne signed the papers without resistance. She agreed that their marriage had never been valid, claimed that she had never been a true wife, and renounced the title of Queen. For this, Henry rewarded her with something far rarer than jewels: her life, her freedom, and an income large enough to live comfortably in England as the king's beloved sister. It was a fiction, of course, but a kind one, and Anne embraced it. She moved to Richmond, then to Hever Castle, where she spent her days reading, walking in gardens, and riding through the countryside. She kept her own household, her own servants, her own peace. She visited court occasionally, always respectful, always smiling. When she met Henry's new wives, she bowed and addressed them as "Your Majesty," and no one could detect in her tone the faintest trace of bitterness. It was as though she had learned the art that none of the others had mastered, the art of surviving Henry without loving him. She did not tempt his pride, did not challenge his faith, did not test the fragile limits of his affection. She existed in the quiet space between his tempests, untouched by the thunder. When Catherine Howard rose and fell, Anne was still alive. When Catherine Parr became queen, and later widow, Anne was still alive. Through all the deaths, the coronations, and the trials, she remained constant, the foreign woman who had entered a nightmare and walked out smiling. The courtiers, at first dismissive, came to admire her. She was gracious to servants, kind to children, gentle with the aging king when they met again in later years. Once, when Henry visited her estate, he laughed for the first time in months. "You are my true sister," he told her, "for you alone never did me wrong." She smiled, courtied, and did not remind him that it was he who had wronged her. When Henry died, Anne attended his funeral as a mourner, but not as a widow. She bowed her head, prayed quietly, and then rode back to her home, where the air was clean, and no one watched her breathe. As the years slipped by, Anne grew stout and cheerful, fond of good food and long walks. She kept portraits of her stepchildren on her walls, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, and wrote letters of affection to them all. They, in turn, visited her when they could. Elizabeth, especially, seemed drawn to her, perhaps recognizing in this gentle woman a rare kind of strength. Anne had outlived not only Henry, but nearly everyone who had once conspired for or against her. She watched from a distance as the kingdom tore itself apart over religion, as fires burned in Mary's reign and conspiracies shadowed Elizabeth's youth. Yet she remained untouched, a quiet island of memory in a sea of unrest. When death came to her in the summer of 1557, it was gentle and unremarked by the world. No scaffolds were built, no priests wept, no king tore his garments. She died peacefully at Chelsea Old Manor, her last words said to be a prayer for England. They buried her in Westminster Abbey, the only one of Henry's wives to rest there beneath a modest monument, carved with her name and a single phrase, Anna Regina Angliae. In that simple title lay her quiet triumph. She had been a queen, however briefly, and she had survived the man who had destroyed so many others. Perhaps that is why her story endures differently from the rest. There is no tragedy of passion, no martyrdom of faith, no crown drenched in blood. There is only the steady grace of a woman who understood that dignity can be stronger than desire, that silence can be safer than brilliance, and that freedom, even when born of humiliation, is still freedom. The others fought to stay queens. Anne of Cleves chose to remain alive. She turned exile into peace, rejection into liberty, and history, in its reluctant honesty, gave her the rarest epitaph of all she survived. And when you imagine her now, do not see her as the plain-faced foreign bride of an impatient king, but as the woman standing at her window in the soft light of evening, the fields of England stretching before her, the air heavy with summer scent. Her hands rest on the sill. Her rings glint faintly, and for once, no one is watching. The wind stirs her hair, and she smiles, not the smile of conquest, but of release. For Anne of Cleves was the queen who learned that escape, when it comes wrapped in disgrace, is still the sweetest kind of victory. After Anne of Cleves slipped quietly into history, the palace once again grew restless, as if the great stone walls themselves could not bear the silence of contentment for long. Henry was older now, heavier, his heart burdened by years of indulgence and regret. But inside him the hunger still burned, that insatiable need to possess, to believe that one more woman might restore his youth. One more bride might remind him that he was still a king who could command love as easily as fear. And then she appeared. A girl, really. Soft-voiced and golden-haired. Her laughter like music that belonged to another world. Her name was Catherine Howard, and she would be the last spark of joy before the darkness swallowed everything. She was a niece of the powerful Duke of Norfolk, cousin to Anne Boleyn, raised not in a royal court but in a noble household that pretended at virtue while quietly breeding scandal. Catherine's youth had been spent among music masters and tutors, among whispers and shadows, in the lively, reckless company of other young wards of the Duchess of Norfolk. She had known flattery before she knew caution, affection before she knew duty, and the language of desire long before she learned the language of prayer. When she came to court as lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves, she was 17, a child in silk, radiant, unguarded, and full of that innocent vanity that makes beauty believe it is invincible. The king saw her one evening at court, her face bright under the candlelight, her dance light as air, and for the first time in years, he forgot to be old. Catherine's laughter became the sound of resurrection. He called her, "My rose without a thorn," and those words, once spoken, sealed her fate. The courtiers who had once curried favour with Anne of Cleves now turned their attention to this new sun rising in the king's weary sky. The Howards, clever and ambitious, saw their chance to reclaim power through her. They fed her innocence to Henry's longing, and within months, the child who had been a lady-in-waiting became Queen of England. The wedding took place in July of 1540. The court, hungry for spectacle, rejoiced. The king, dressed in white and gold, swore that he had never been so happy. He called her his jewel, his comfort, his youth renewed. Catherine smiled shyly and blushed. But inside, perhaps, she was terrified. For what could a 17-year-old girl know of the heart of a man who had buried wives and broken kingdoms? Yet she tried. Oh, she tried to be the dream he needed. She sang for him, danced for him, called him My husband and sovereign lord. When he grew weary, she read to him softly. When his ulcers flared, she soothed his brow with her cool hands. For a time, she succeeded. The court glittered again. Music filled the great halls. Henry smiled in public, and the people whispered that England might finally have peace. But peace built on illusion is the most fragile of all. Catherine's beauty became her prison. Her youth, her undoing. She was adored not for who she was, but for what she seemed to represent: innocence restored. Sin vergeten. Youth reclaimed. Yet beneath that golden image beat a terrified, confused heart. The young queen, barely able to sign her name, found herself surrounded by eyes that watched her every movement. Servants who reported every word. Her every smile became a rumor. Her every kindness a potential sin, and within that suffocating world of suspicion, a single secret began to grow like rot beneath the petals of a rose. Before her marriage, Catherine had known affection, a foolish, reckless affection from two men. First, her music tutor, Henry Manox, and later, a gentleman named Francis Derham. They were not lovers of power, but of youth. Men who had whispered sweet lies into the ears of a lonely girl in borrowed silk. Those moments, meaningless to the child she had been, became weapons in the hands of her enemies when she became queen. At first, no one dared speak. Henry, radiant in his illusion, refused to believe that his perfect bride could know anything of sin. But the court is a serpent that feeds on rumor, and when a jealous servant, desperate for reward, confessed to Archbishop Cranmer that the Queen had been unchaste before marriage, the whisper became a storm. Cranmer, terrified but loyal to the king, carried the news like a man carrying fire. Henry at first laughed it off, then demanded proof. And when proof was brought, letters, testimonios, memories twisted into accusation, something inside him snapped. The man who had called her his rose now saw only thorns. The girl who had been his salvation was now his shame. He left Hampton Court without a word, leaving Catherine trembling in her rooms, unaware of the danger that had already consumed her. Days passed in a silence thick as fog. She prayed. She paced. She asked to see her husband. No answer came. Then, one morning in November, the guards arrived. She was escorted to Sion Abbey, not as a queen, but as a prisoner. Her laughter was gone. Her ladies wept as she walked past them, her steps slow, her face pale with disbelief. "Tell His Majesty I am his true wife," she whispered, "and that I loved him." It was the only truth she had left. In the months that followed, the investigation deepened. Men she had once known were dragged to the tower, questioned, tortured, executed. Their blood washed the cobblestones clean of her innocence. Letters she had written in her girlish hand were read aloud before councils of grim-faced men. And each word, each careless endearment, became evidence of treason. She was accused not only of fornication before her marriage, but of adultery after it, with a courtier named Thomas Culpeper, the only man she may have truly loved. The accusation was enough to condemn her. Whether it was true or not no longer mattered. In the eyes of Henry, the betrayal was a mirror showing him the truth. He could not bear to face that he was mortal. That time had defeated him, that no beauty could restore what the years had taken. When the sentence came, Catherine knelt and listened, her eyes dry. Death by beheading, to be carried out within the walls of the Tower of London. She asked for a block so she might practice how to lay her head upon it. The guard, shaken, brought one, and she knelt before it over and over again. whispering prayers until fear itself seemed to dissolve into stillness. On the morning of her execution, she dressed in a gown of black velvet, trimmed with fur. Her hair tucked neatly beneath a linen hood. The air was grey, the ground damp with dew. She was 19. As she walked toward the scaffold, the crowd pressed close, murmuring prayers and sobs. She climbed the steps with grace, her hands clasped, her lips moving in silent confession. Turning to the witnesses, she spoke in a voice calm and clear enough to still the wind. "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper." The crowd gasped, not at the words themselves, but at the courage it took to speak them. Then she knelt, laid her head upon the block, and whispered, "Lord, I have mercy upon me." The axe fell, and in that single instant, the music of her laughter vanished forever from England's air. They buried her beside her cousin Anne in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. Two heads that had once worn crowns. Two hearts that had once dared to believe in love. The king did not attend her execution. They said he stayed in his chamber, drinking heavily, muttering that she had deceived him, yet unable to sleep. He had called her his rose without a thorn, but the rose had drawn blood, and the wound would never truly heal. And what remains of Catherine Howard? Not the child bride or the condemned sinner, but something far more fragile and human, the embodiment of youth devoured by power, of innocence twisted into spectacle. She was a girl, thrown into the storm of a man's vanity, a girl who had never learned that beauty is a dangerous currency in a world ruled by men who mistake desire for love. Her tragedy is not that she died too young, but that she never had the chance to grow into anything beyond the fantasy others made of her. Sometimes, when dusk falls upon the tower, the guards whisper that they have heard soft footsteps along the stone corridor near the chapel, a faint echo of silk brushing against cold walls, followed by the sound of a young woman weeping softly, then laughing as though she has suddenly remembered joy. They say that is Catherine Howard, still running through the corridors of her last night, still searching for the door that will not open, still whispering the words that sealed her fate. I loved him, and perhaps, somewhere beyond time, she is forgiven. For in her brief, radiant life, she gave a weary kingdom, one last illusion of youth, one last spark before the darkness. And even as the blade fell, she remained, in her way, what Henry had called her a rose without a thorn, perfect only in the instant of her death. When the echo of Catherine Howard's final breath faded from the tower, England itself seemed to draw a shuddering silence. The court that had once thrived on scandal now moved as if afraid to speak too loudly, afraid to wake the ghost of a girl whose laughter had been too alive for the palace's cold walls. Henry, older and heavier now, bore his loneliness like a sickness he refused to name. His body was decaying, his legs ulcered, his temper quick to ignite, his eyes dulled by years of suspicion and grief, but his appetite for control remained ferocious. He had buried 5 wives. 1 by mercy, 2 by execution, 2 by childbirth, 1 by exile. Yet even after all of that, the king still looked for redemption in the face of another woman. And this time, God or fate or perhaps simply exhaustion sent him someone different. Her name was Catherine Parr, and she would be the only wife to both save and survive him. Catherine Parr was not a child, nor a courtly toy of politics. She was a woman formed by loss, tempered by intelligence, and guided by something neither faith nor ambition could fully define. Born in the summer of 1512, she had already buried 2 husbands before the king ever set his eyes upon her. From her first marriage, she learned endurance. From her second, grief. But between the two, she had learned something rarer, still, independence. She could read Latin and French, discuss theology with scholars, and hold her ground in any conversation, even those that turned dangerous. Yet she was also gentle, compassionate, and calm, a presence that steadied any room she entered. It was this calm, this quiet intellect, veiled in modest grace, that drew the attention of the most dangerous man in England. When Henry decided to court her, Catherine's heart was already pledged elsewhere. She loved Thomas Seymour, the brother of the late Queen Jane, a charming and reckless man whose ambition glittered like glass. But no woman could refuse a king's proposal and live without consequence. And Catherine, wise enough to read the past, bowed to destiny. If it were my choice, she later confessed, I would rather have chosen happiness of my heart than greatness of estate. Yet she married Henry, knowing full well what had become of the women before her. Perhaps she thought her faith would protect her, or perhaps she simply believed that she could outthink fate. In truth, she would need to. The wedding took place in July of 1543. Henry was 52, Catherine 31. The court, weary of blood, welcomed the new queen with cautious relief. She was dignified, kind to the king's children, and far too intelligent to threaten him openly. Unlike Anne Boleyn or Catherine Howard, she did not rely on youth or beauty to keep his attention. She gave him peace, conversation, and the illusion of moral order. With her came a softer rhythm. The court's feasts grew calmer, the laughter more restrained, the gossip quieter. Even the king seemed changed. In her presence, he was almost gentle. But Catherine's reign as queen was not merely one of survival. She became a scholar, a reformer, and one of the most learned women of her age. She surrounded herself with poets, theologians, and thinkers of the Reformed faith, reading the banned works of Erasmus and Luther by candlelight long after the king had fallen asleep. She believed deeply that every soul had the right to read scripture in their own language, that faith was not the property of priests, but the birthright of the heart. Her chambers became a sanctuary for quiet discussion and dangerous ideas, where women could speak their minds in whispers and be heard. Yet every candle that burns too brightly casts a shadow. The Church of England, newly born and already fractured, was a nest of intrigue. Bishops and courtiers alike sought to measure the Queen's words for evidence of heresy. Catherine's intelligence and her quiet reformist sympathies made her a target. Her enemies, led by Bishop Stephen Gardiner and Lord Wriothesley, began to whisper that the Queen had gone too far, that she denied the presence of Christ in the sacrament, that she was leading the king away from true faith. And in those whispers, once again, death began to stir. The year was 1546. Henry's health was failing fast. His body was swollen, his mind clouded, his temper savage. The council, sensing the approaching end, began to shift and scheme like vultures preparing for the fall of a great beast. When Gardiner presented the idea that the Queen herself might be heretical, Henry did not immediately dismiss it. Perhaps he was tired of her correction, her scripture readings, her gentle but persistent efforts to reform him. Perhaps he simply wanted silence. Either way, he gave the order. A warrant was drawn for Catherine's arrest. The plan was simple. The guards would seize her after supper, take her to the Tower, and the next Queen's tragedy would begin. But fate, for once, faltered. One of Catherine's servants, loyal and terrified, discovered the warrant and ran to her with the news. It was the night before her planned arrest. The Queen, trembling but composed, understood immediately that argument or logic could not save her, only submission could. So the next day, when she entered the king's chamber, she did not wait for accusation. She knelt before him and spoke with perfect humility. "Your Majesty," she said, "whatever I have spoken was only to delight and amuse you, to give you comfort when your mind was heavy with the cares of state. I am but a poor woman, ignorant in comparison to your divine learning." Henry stared at her, perhaps uncertain, perhaps amused. "And is it so, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Then you have become a good woman now." Catherine, steady as stone, answered, "And ever shall be, if it please your Majesty." In that instant, she disarmed him completely. The warrant, already signed, was never executed. When the guards came to arrest her that evening, Henry struck them with his cane and cursed them for traitors. "The Queen and I are friends again," he thundered. Catherine lived the only one to face the shadow of death and turn it away with words. In the years that followed, she became the quiet heart of the royal family. She reconciled the king with his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, and gave them an education that would shape the very future of England. She stood beside him at council, read letters aloud when his eyesight dimmed, and soothed him when the pain in his legs made him curse heaven itself. When he died in January of 1547, she was there, the widow who had survived him, the woman who had endured where others had perished. But survival is not the same as peace. After Henry's death, Catherine at last followed her heart and married Thomas Seymour. It should have been her reward, the beginning of the happiness she had postponed for duty's sake. Instead, it became a coda of sorrow. Seymour was handsome, reckless, and ambitious. His charm had once seemed intoxicating. Now it turned to poison. As the Dowager Queen, Catherine held great wealth and influence. Seymour sought to use it. He schemed for power, flirted openly with the young Princess Elizabeth who lived under Catherine's roof, and turned the Queen's home into a stage of uneasy scandal. The same intelligence that had saved her from the king now forced her to see what her love truly was, another illusion. Another cage, gilded with deceit. In early 1548, Catherine discovered she was pregnant, her first child. A miracle long denied her. For a few months, she glowed with that fragile happiness that always seems too bright for this world. But fate, cruel and familiar, came for her once more. In August, she gave birth to a daughter, Mary Seymour, and within days the fever set in. She had watched Jane Seymour die from the same infection 11 years before, and now, lying in the same agony. She must have known her time had come. The delirium grew, and in her fevered state she accused her husband of poisoning her. Whether it was truth or Paine's wild dream, no one knew. On the 5th of September, Catherine Parr, Queen, Chola, reformer, survivor, died at 36 years old. Her last words were whispered prayers for mercy. They buried her at Sudeley Castle, wrapped in white linen, her face serene, her Bible resting upon her chest. Unlike the others, there was no scandal, no blood, no disgrace, only silence and the smell of fading lavender. Her tomb still stands there, carved with the words she lived by: to be useful in my generation and to serve God in the truth of his word. She was not remembered for beauty or passion, but for wisdom, compassion, and the strange, luminous strength that comes from having faced death and chosen kindness instead of bitterness. And yet, perhaps her greatest legacy was not the peace she brought to a dying king, nor the calm she left behind in a kingdom scarred by cruelty, but the education she gave to a girl who would one day rule England as Elizabeth I. In that girl's mind lived Catherine's patience, her wit, her courage, and her love of learning. Through Elizabeth, the last queen of Henry's blood, the voice of Catherine Parr would echo across time, a voice that taught a kingdom that intellect could be power, that gentleness could be armor, and that survival, when wrapped in grace, could be its own form of victory. And so the story of Henry's wives neared its end, not with execution, but with quiet redemption. Catherine Parr was the queen who read too much, who thought too deeply, who loved too bravely, and who managed, for a fleeting moment, to make even a tyrant believe in peace. She did not rule through fear, nor fade through obedience. She walked the thin line between them, and in doing so, she outlasted them all. And if you listen on still nights, in the gardens of Sudeley, where the ivy curls around her tomb, you may hear pages turning softly in the wind, the sound of the queen who lived by words and left the world wrapped in their eternal mercy. Long after Catherine Parr's last breath had vanished into the soft air above Sudeley Castle, the grand stories of the queens began to quiet, but the whisper of their world still lingered in the stone corridors and the narrow staircases, in the kitchens and bedchambers and echoing halls where eyes had always watched and ears had always listened. For though history remembers the crowns, it forgets the hands that fastened them. Behind every queen who ever walked the marble floors of the Tudor court, there stood another kingdom smaller, invisible, but endlessly alive, the kingdom of those who served. These were the watchers, the bearers, the silent keepers of secrets. They held bowls of rosewater and pins of gold, but also letters that could destroy, whispers that could save, and glances that decided whether a head would wear a crown or roll into a basket. This was their story, the story of the servants who saw everything. The day in a royal household began long before the queen's eyelids opened. In the grey light before dawn, chambermaids stirred the fires back to life, their hands rough and scarred from years of scrubbing stone. The laundresses carried in baskets of linen, still damp from the night's washing, their breath misting in the cold. They moved silently, for even the smallest sound could be misinterpreted by those who slept nearby. They were the ghosts of the palace, their names forgotten, their faces unrecorded, yet their work shaped the very rhythm of royal life. It was they who warmed the queen's sheets, who brushed her gowns, who polished the jeweled girdles that would later flash beneath the eyes of foreign ambassadors. They carried the scent of lavender, of sweat, of iron. They carried also the burden of knowing too much. For no one in England knew the truth of a queen's body like the women who cleaned her linens. They saw what no courtier could see, the stains that told of health or illness, of fertility or failure. When the sheets came back from the royal bedchamber, the laundresses whispered among themselves in the low, conspiratorial murmur of those who understood that power could live or die upon a single drop of blood. They knew when a queen's courses came late, when they came early, when they did not come at all. They were the first to know when a royal pregnancy had begun, and often the first to know when it had ended in silence. Yet they could tell no one, at least not directly. But secrets, like smoke, always find their way through cracks. A careless phrase at the water trough, a nervous glance at a priest, a sigh overheard by a groom. These small slips travelled upward through invisible threads until they reached the ears of courtiers, ministers, and, finally, the king. Above them, in the hierarchy of service, stood the ladies in waiting, women of noble birth whose presence blurred the line between servant and spy. They were chosen not for loyalty but for lineage. Each one represented a family, a faction, a political interest. When they brushed the queen's hair or laced her corset, they did so with eyes open and minds alert, memorizing every word, every bruise, every tremor. They saw when the queen was fevered or pale, when she slept fitfully, when she turned away from her husband's touch. And each night, as the palace darkened, they carried these observations to their secret masters, the ambassadors who paid them, the ministers who promised them security, the relatives who demanded their vigilance. They were the currency of the court, and every secret they held had a price. Yet even amongst bees, there were those who loved. Some of these women, hardened by years of caution, found themselves unexpectedly loyal to the queens they served. One might hold her mistress's hand during childbirth and weep as the midwives prayed. Another might risk her life to smuggle a letter from a condemned queen to her child. These moments of quiet bravery rarely survived in ink, but they flickered through time like the glow of candles left burning in forbidden windows. When Anne Boleyn was imprisoned in the Tower, it was her ladies who wrapped her trembling body in velvet each morning and helped her kneel for prayer. When Catherine Howard practiced laying her head upon the block, it was one of her attendants who held the pillow for her, tears running silently down her face. Their names, mostly lost, deserved to be spoken alongside those of queens. For without them, the stories of Henry's wives would be nothing but empty ceremony. In the lower corridors of the palace, where the air smelled of wood smoke and spilled ale, another network of watchers hummed the kitchen boys. The footmen, the grooms, the scribes, they moved unseen, carrying dishes, letters, and rumours. The kitchen was its own parliament of gossip. There, amid the clatter of pewter and the hiss of roasting meat, the lives of queens were dissected with the precision of butchers. A scullery maid might hear that the queen refused her meal again, that her appetite had waned a sign, perhaps, of pregnancy or despair. A cook might overhear that the physician had visited 3 times that week. By nightfall, these details would travel through servants' passages to the guards, then to the chamberlains, then to those who made their living by interpretation. The palace, from cellar to chapel, was a single organism of listening, and in the center of that organism was the physician, the man who held both life and death in his hands, and whose remedies often led to one more than the other. He entered the queen's chambers each morning with a leather bag heavy with leeches and powders, bowing low before the bed as he inquired after her humours. He called his work medicine, though most of it was ritual draining blood, prescribing crushed gems and ground beetles, wrapping the skin in poultices that burned like fire. He did not know he was killing her slowly, or perhaps he did, but dared not admit it. For to heal a queen too well was to tempt the envy of a king who believed illness was divine punishment. The servants who held the basins for these treatments saw the truth. They saw the trembling hands, the hollow eyes, the faint scars that never faded. They saw, too, the pity in the doctor's face when he looked at a woman who was more symbol than soul. But of all the silent witnesses, none held more power than the chamberlain. It was he who controlled access to the queen's presence, who decided which petitioners might speak and which must wait. He knew the rhythm of her days when she prayed, when she dined, when she wept, and because he guarded the door to her world, he could choose when to open it and when to let her suffocate within it. Many a queen's fall began, not with an accusation but with a hesitation, a door that opened one moment too late, a message that never reached her hands, a servant's bow that lingered long enough to suggest betrayal. There were also the scribes and secretaries, men who bent over their parchments like monks, transcribing letters they were never meant to read. They copied the words of queens pleading for mercy, words that passed through their ink-stained hands and into history's judgment. Some altered the letters subtly, adding phrases that changed meaning, softening a confession or sharpening an accusation. A single misplaced word could cost a life. Yet when their work was done, they sealed the pages with wax, bowed to their masters, and returned to their desks, never speaking of what they knew. Theirs was the quietest power of all the power to shape truth through ink. Even the guards who patrolled the palace at night were part of this web. They walked through the shadowed corridors, the tips of their halberds scraping the stone, their ears tuned to the smallest sound. They saw lovers meeting in secret, courtiers sneaking from chambers, ladies sobbing in prayer. They knew which doors were locked from within and which were left open as invitations. And when the order came to arrest a queen, as it always did, sooner or later, it was these same guards who carried out the duty. They had seen her smile, had watched her walk in silk and jewels, had bowed to her every morning. And then, on the appointed day, they entered her rooms and took her away. Some could not bear it. Others did it with practiced indifference. But all of them knew that to hesitate even once was to share her fate. Beyond the palace gates, the servants' world continued into the streets of London. The coachmen who drove royal carriages carried gossip like wind through the city. The washerwomen who laundered court garments told stories to their neighbours as they beat the water from the cloth. The baker who supplied the royal kitchens, the messenger who galloped to Dover, the tailor who fitted the Queen's gowns, all of them were threads in the vast tapestry of Tudor life. They saw more than they understood, and yet they understood enough to know that power was a flame that consumed anyone who stood too near it. Sometimes, when night fell and the palace slept, one could hear faint voices from the servants' quarters' laughter, songs, murmured prayers for those who would never pray again. They lived in the margins of history, yet they carried its weight upon their backs. They were the ones who held trembling hands before the axe fell, who cleaned the chambers after death, who lit the candles for souls no priest would name aloud. They were the quiet mourners, the unacknowledged authors of truth, and though their names were lost, their presence endures, like fingerprints left on the polished silver of forgotten banquets. For every queen who rose and fell, there were dozens who knelt beside her, unseen, their loyalty or betrayal shaping the story more deeply than any crown could. The servants knew what history never tells, that power does not belong to those who rule but to those who witness. They saw everything, remembered everything, and carried it forward in whispers that outlasted thrones. And even now, if you listen closely in the empty halls of Hampton Court, you may hear them still: the rustle of linen, the sigh of brushes against velvet, the soft murmur of women who once stood at the edges of greatness, recording its downfall in silence. They were the servants who saw everything, and in their quiet watching, they became the truest keepers of the Tudor Queen's immortal sorrow.